Hello, and welcome to Utopian and Dystopian Fictions, a podcast hosted by me, Matt Leggett, a senior lecturer at the University of Winchester, where I teach utopian and dystopian fiction.
And me, Liam Knight, an independent scholar who holds a PhD in English literature from the University of Birmingham.
In each episode, we interview a different scholar, thinker, or writer, asking them to help us myth bust commonly held assumptions about utopias and dystopias.
If you like what you hear, please let us know by following the podcast, rating it on Spotify, or dropping us a message on utopian and dystopian fictions at gmail.com. So, Matt, who do we talk to in this episode?
Hi, Liam. Today we have Sean Seeger. Sean is a senior lecturer in modern and contemporary literature at the University of Essex, and he's written extensively on utopia, and in particular on contemporary speculative fictions, which is a term that he briefly explains in the interview if you're not quite sure what that means. But yeah, I mean, again, I really enjoyed interviewing Sean. He's a great speaker on this subject, and I think that again, thinking about myths in relation to utopianism, this is another episode which really kind of busts quite a few of those kinds of myths without necessarily, I think we kind of had an idea if there was one particular thing we were going to target, but we ended up kind of covering quite a few different areas. So in terms of those sort of myths, he's been writing recently about something he calls, quote, utopian pessimism, which I think very neatly addresses the assumed connection between utopia and optimism, and like the reverse with dystopia and pessimism. So in our discussion, he very clearly dismantles this myth through reference to a number of texts, in particular Carl Neville's novel Eminent Domain, which I should imagine most people aren't familiar with. It's not that widely read, certainly not a novel that I'd read. But from my, from our discussion, I get the sense it explores an imperfect socialist utopia, as well as sort of more familiar works people might be more familiar with. For example, Octavia Butler's works like Parable of the Sower, which I know we've talked about. I think I spoke with Raffaella Bacalini briefly about Parable of the Sower, and Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, which is a fantastic novel, really deep piece of work. But yeah, there are other myths we also end up discussing. In particular, for example, the myth connecting utopia and perfection, which I know was something again that came up in the discussion last time around with Dan Van Dell, and also utopia and the impossible, which I think is another kind of common kind of connection that people make. So yeah, so we're in the first episode, we explored the critical dystopia with Raffaella Bacalini. Early in this interview, Sean talks about its kind of originator, if you like, the critical utopia, and we explore, we discussed blueprint utopias and challenge some of the sort of dominant ideas about those. And yeah, in the latter half of the interview, the discussion turns to human nature and the impact of various technological developments on future visions of utopia and dystopia. Sean also makes the really interesting suggestion, I think, that even if we achieve utopia, human existence will continue to be unsatisfactory. And so we need to think about what are those kind of outer limits, if you like, of utopia. I just found that particular idea really fascinating, that even if we do somehow get to utopia, it's not gonna be perfect for us. It's gonna be unsatisfactory.
Yeah, I think I echo what you're saying about Sean being a really great speaker. I was fortunate enough to meet with him at the Utopian Studies Society of Europe conference in Brighton in 2022, where he gave a paper that actually touched on one of the novels he speaks about in the interview. So that was Yaris Varoufakis's 2020 novel, Another Now. And so it was really great to sort of revisit that. I know it was something that really interested me and sort of perplexed me, I guess, at the time. So I felt quite fortunate to be able to listen to Sean's thoughts on that a little bit more. And he has got, as he mentions in the interview, an article on that too, which I'll endeavour to put into the episode description as well. A link out to that so people can find that for themselves and have a read. I think I really valued Sean's dismantling of the myth that is the connection between utopia and optimism, or utopia and perfection. I think we often, and I'm saying this broadly, but we're often maybe guilty of seeing utopia as this perfect place, and there's no qualms, no issues, and maybe not even any sort of dissatisfaction within them. I think he takes that down a few notches, not just sort of saying utopia is better rather than perfect, but that there can be pessimism within utopian thinking. I know there's a point where he sort of rejects the blueprint utopias and sort of suggests that if we are looking to have a blueprint utopia, maybe that isn't as utopian as it could be, because then it's suggesting that there is only one fixed way in which to achieve utopia, and that in itself, I'm sort of paraphrasing here and adding my own spin to it slightly, but that maybe is a totalitarian way almost of thinking about utopia. We must achieve utopia, but only in this one way that maybe only one person likes. I don't know, Matt, if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's a good point, and one of the key criticisms of utopia has been this sort of tendency, particularly in the sort of latter half of the 20th century, that utopias create totalitarian dictatorships, and it's one of those things that as a quote unquote utopianist or whatever, as a utopian scholar, you constantly find yourself battling against, pushing back against that people will say, oh well, aren't all of these visions of utopia also sort of totalitarian nightmares, and to some extent some of them certainly are, but at the same time I kind of feel like everything is a utopian vision to some extent, someone's utopian vision, and if we kind of just discount all utopian visions on the basis that some have led to kind of totalitarian dystopias, then I think we'd have to sort of chuck out the entirety of human history. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. And just going back to the sort of pessimism, the connection between utopia and pessimism, one of the things that struck me about Sean's thinking on it, which I thought was really quite profound, was this idea that, again, just your automatic response to pessimism is that it's a negative thing. But I think actually, in this sense, he talks about it as something that kind of makes the utopia more sort of feasible, more real, more tangible for people, and and sort of dismantle some of those kinds of critiques of utopia that have been quite commonplace in the latter half of the 20th century into the 21st, which is absolutely something we need. If we want to sort of rethink society in any kind of radical way, we have to kind of push back on some of those kind of myths, which is exactly, I suppose, what we're trying to do in this podcast.
I couldn't have put it better myself, Matt. So I think, again, without us giving too much away to the listeners, I think we should hand it over to Sean himself.
Hi, Matthew, and thanks for having me. So I'm a senior lecturer in modern and contemporary literature at the University of Essex. My early work, including my PhD and my first book, were focused on literary modernism. And over the last decade, I've been especially focused on speculative fiction in all its forms, and in particular, utopias and dystopias in literature and film and popular culture.
Just before we get too far into that, when you say speculative fictions, I'm just thinking about who may or may not be listening to this, and it's kind of a fancy word for sort of science fiction and fantasy together. Would you say, what do you sort of see speculative fiction as meaning?
Yeah, so I heard a very good definition of speculative fiction a little while ago, which was that speculative fiction is any kind of fiction that departs from realism. And I like that because it's very expansive. But yeah, I think of it as an umbrella term, and it includes things like alternate history, apocalyptic literature, science fiction, of course, utopias, dystopias, and yeah, related kinds of fiction.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sean. As I said, we really appreciate you coming on, and sort of going on this journey with us. And I think predominantly, I would say you're here to talk about utopia, which is your thing rather than dystopia. But might you say a little bit about what utopia means to you?
Sure. So one thing to say at the beginning is there's something which I think utopia isn't, and that is I don't think of a utopia as being a perfect society. There's been some interesting work on this in utopian studies. I tend to think that when utopia is equated with perfection, that's often a way of discrediting utopian aspirations. And it's something that really begins, I think, during the Cold War, and you can trace that tendency right down to the present. So if it's not a perfect society, then what is it? And I would say, at a minimum, that a utopia is a society that represents a huge improvement in certain important regards on the society that we, or the author, or the audience currently live in. Now, what I like about that is it's a more flexible idea of what utopia is, and it can be filled out in lots of different ways. One person who's put forward a, I think, interesting take on utopia that departs from that idea of perfection is the philosopher Raymond Geuss in his book Reality and Its Dreams, where he says, in effect, that utopia could be thought of as whatever appears to be impossible from within a given situation. Rutger Bregman, the historian, has some interesting case studies of things which were once considered utopian. One of them is abolishing the slave trade, and he provides various examples of people who thought that abolishing slavery was a kind of hopelessly utopian project. But of course, it in part at least came to take place. Today, we could think of something like the idea of rapidly decarbonizing key industries. It seems to be impossible from within our situation, but it might not be. We just need to give it a try, and maybe we can work out a way of doing it.
Is that his book Utopia for Realists that you're
Yes,
referring to?
yes. He has
I mean, I found that a really interesting book. I think there's a lot of good stuff in it, but it plays on that idea that the title plays into that idea that utopia is regarded something, a perfectionist to some extent, and he's sort of challenging that. And I did read something recently, I think, as well. I think it was in a piece by Fatima Vieira, who essentially sort of made this argument that utopia has gone into this space now where it's actually been kind of chopped up into these kind of little sort of small interest groups, if you like, which have these kind of more realistic goals, ways of seeing it. It's less of an umbrella for the kind of big idea, and the kind of modern utopia, if you like, or certainly the 21st century utopia is more a utopia of sort of individual interests, but one that sort of rejects this kind of totalitarian idea, so as a kind of way of skirting that attack on utopia, which I thought was kind of interesting. So is that what you would kind of consider your sort of version of utopia? It's not that kind of big umbrella. It's the kind of small local interest, maybe.
No, actually, my own view is that in the 2020s right now, I think we need a much more positive, substantial idea of what utopia is. And the tendency that, I haven't read that article, but the tendency that's being described there, I recognize that. And I think that really begins probably in the 1980s. And part of that is a kind of opposition to, as you say, the idea of utopian blueprints, the idea of very ambitious kind of calls for utopian change. I understand why critics of that kind of utopia emerged, and in utopian studies, of course, as you know, there's been some really good arguments against that approach. But in an article that I published last year, I've got an analysis of a novel by Yanis Varoufakis, the previous Greek Minister of Finance, which is, I think, a really interesting attempt to combine some of these criticisms of utopia that have gone on over the last, say, 40 years or so, with a really ambitious utopian blueprint. And in effect, what he does in that book, in a way which is really carefully researched and I think quite brilliantly argued, is to give a kind of account, a quite detailed account of what a post-capitalist alternative would look like. And it's as ambitious as it gets. It's really a call for a kind of global transformation. And I think given the kind of challenges that we're facing, I think we need utopianism of that much more ambitious sort. I think its time has come. And I'm also very suspicious about this tendency to fragment utopia and to kind of shrink it down and down.
Divided we fall, as they say. Yeah, I mean, I think you know it's this piece that you're talking about. You referred to the post-critical utopia, I believe, in that piece. What does it mean? Why post-critical for you? What's that term mean?
In utopian studies, the idea of the critical utopia was really put into circulation by Tom Moylan and also to some extent by Lyman Tower Sargent, and it's been widely used. And it's essentially the idea that we ought to give up on a certain utopian blueprint model of how to go about improving society or the world. But we should hold on to what Tom Moylan calls utopian dreaming. That's to say, we need to remain aware of utopian possibilities and kind of keep an eye out for those, while resisting this idea that there is a kind of singular blueprint for how radical change ought to occur. And what I think Varoufakis tries to do in his book in a really imaginative way is to propose something like an ambitious global blueprint for radical change, while also incorporating some of these criticisms that have been made of utopia over the last few decades. So he keeps open, I suppose, a kind of reflexive space for self-criticism. So just to take one example of that tendency over the last 40 years or so, there's been powerful feminist criticisms of certain kinds of kind of classical utopianism. And I think Varoufakis manages to leave his book open to some of these possibilities and to keep in mind that whatever this utopian blueprint is, it's going to come in for criticism from different constituencies. So he's tried to kind of anticipate that and build in this kind of reflexivity while also making it very ambitious, which is quite a difficult line, I think, to walk. But I think he does it quite well.
I'm gonna have to read it. It's going to go on a very long reading list. I think this podcast, if anything, is going to just mean my Goodreads list just grows and grows. It sounds fascinating. I've kind of been writing a little bit myself about blueprint utopias, something I'm interested in. I kind of find the idea of the blueprint utopia difficult in the first instance because I wonder if it often gets misattributed. I mean, for me at least, most of the so-called sort of blueprint utopias, the author seems to destabilize that blueprint anyway through the narrative position, right? I mean, what I mean is that, we aren't supposed to be sure about the blueprint in the first place. I feel like the central purpose is more to invite readers to suggest their own amendments, their own blueprints. So, I mean, for example, we go back to Moore, then Moore himself having, himself as a character in the text, who at the end basically ends up denying most of what Raphael Hythloday tells him about the utopians, seems to sort of put us on some sort of uneven ground. We don't know how much of the text is a recommendation and how much of it is kind of fanciful, or how much of it's satirical. And debates about the satirical nature of the text have been going round and round. So I kind of feel that about other utopias as well, that there are very few genuine kind of like, here's a manifesto, if you like. There are a lot of kind of, there's a lot of sort of techniques that utopian writers have used in order to sort of destabilize that ground.
I completely agree with that, and I would agree that it's right there from the word go with Thomas More onwards, and I recognise that. I think two things I would say. One is I think that the turn against ambitious utopianism and against blueprints, and certainly in its kind of political manifestation against communism, which really begins in the Cold War, is the beginning of a kind of anti-utopian turn in Western culture, and it's been brilliantly explored by various writers. I won't try to summarize too many different texts that come to mind, but one thing I think is worth saying is, even though when you get down to it, these texts are much more ambiguous and kind of polysemic and overdetermined than they're sometimes presented as being. Nevertheless, in the culture, there's been this anti-utopian turn, and I think the result has been to kind of shrink the boundaries of the social imaginary, the kind of boundaries of what we could imagine as viable change. And I think that's been a pernicious tendency. It's a bit like your previous point about the fragmentation of utopia. There's a way in which what it has become possible to imagine has shrunk especially during the neoliberal era. And Mark Fisher in particular, of course, comes to mind here writing about this. So what I would say is, yes, I'm talking, I suppose, about how utopias have been perceived as much as anything. The texts themselves are very, very interesting and ambiguous things, but utopia has been perceived in a certain way over these decades, and the result has been, I think, to write off the very idea of radical change, and I think that is something we really need to push back against. I suppose that's what I'm really talking about.
Yeah, I think I really agree with that. There's a kind of compression, isn't there, and in culture, and the way in which we digest texts as well, in the fact that the majority of people, I think, don't actually even read the text that they cite from or talk about. That they tend to do damage to the texts themselves. Going back to quizzing you on things I suppose that you've been writing recently. You've been writing for an edited collection. I have to put my hands up and say the edited collection is mine, so I suppose I should probably say that out loud. But it's not out yet, so if anyone's googling this or trying to search for this piece, you won't find it yet. But it will be out sooner rather than later. And you've written a piece on what you've called pessimistic utopianism, which I thought was a really interesting kind of term or phrase. So I wondered what you may, how you define this in some way, or what you kind of think pessimistic utopianism means.
Yeah, so of course, your collection is all about utopian myths. So the way I took that was being about things people believe about utopia, but which actually don't necessarily stand up to scrutiny when we
which is what we've already been talking about quite a bit. I think that's kind of probably what utopian scholars do all the time, is trying to spend their time debunking the various myths about the term. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I heard that was the subject, I was drawn to it immediately. But my contribution is really about the relationship between utopia and optimism on the one hand, and dystopia and pessimism on the other. And it's very widely assumed, as you know, that utopia must be optimistic and dystopia must be pessimistic. And if anyone is listening wants to do this, if you do a quick Google news search for utopia or dystopia, what you find looking over the last 10 years is many, many, many articles in newspapers and kind of popular sources that do just assume that utopia is optimistic and dystopia is always pessimistic. And what I want to say in part is that when we look at the texts more closely, it's much more complicated than that, as it usually is with these sorts of works. In utopian studies, there's been some recognition of that. So I won't try and go into too much detail about them, but there are people who have talked about critical utopias in which someone proposes a utopia and then actually spends a lot of time thinking about some of the problems that it would throw up. And then there's also the critical dystopia, where people have analysed novels like the Parable books of Octavia Butler, where you have a very bleak dystopian scenario, but it actually has a kind of core of hope running through it. So those are initial kind of counterexamples to this idea that it's very, very straightforward to say what kind of ethos these texts are kind of allied to. But my article is a reading of a novel from 2020 by a British writer called Carl Neville, and it's called Eminent Domain. It's a very interesting book, and I recommend it to people. And I think it represents a rather different, if you imagine this all plotted on a sort of graph, it's kind of off on its own somewhere. I think it's really quite unusual. So it's a novel which just briefly describes a future where socialism has triumphed across much of Europe and Africa and some other parts of the world, not the United States, and where Britain has become a socialist republic. And it's partly an alternate history because it imagines the Cold War had unfolded differently, the Soviet Union democratized, and so on and so forth. And what I find really striking is that the book combines, on my interpretation, utopianism on the one hand with a kind of pessimism in a way which is, I think, quite original. So historically, and I talk a bit about this in the article, political conservatism has tended to be anti-utopian. It tends to adopt a pessimistic view of human nature. And as I say in the article, you can trace this all the way back to probably St. Augustine and even beyond, with some of what he says about original sin, our fallen natures, and so on. So on that view of our kind of fallen nature, the very idea of utopia, the very idea of radically improving things is kind of off the table. What I think is really thought-provoking about Neville's book is that it seems to combine a kind of unabashed utopianism on the one hand with this deep pessimism in the background. Now, it's not the way I see it, it's not a pessimism about human nature as such. In fact, as the book makes clear in the later sections, human nature is treated really as something changeable and contingent in the books. There's lots of people, for example, who are upgrading their bodies and minds using technology and all sorts of things. So human nature is kind of very flexible in this world, but it's still got a kind of pessimism in it about, and it's hard to know exactly what to call this, but in the article I call it the human situation. There's pessimism about human situation, the basic kind of parameters of any kind of human life, whatever. And whether it's intended or not, the novel seems to imply that even if we achieve utopia, and it is, again, as I say, an unabashedly utopian novel in many regards, he thinks that human existence will continue to be deeply unsatisfactory in many ways. And you see characters in the book grappling with different sources of dissatisfaction. There's encounters with death, with grief, existential angst, jealousy is a big part of it, people resenting others, a kind of irrational hatred which surfaces in different places, despite the fact that they've achieved this utopian society. And I think that utopian scholars listening to this might think that what Neville has actually written is a kind of anti-utopia, where he sets up a utopia and then he's undermined it. But I don't think that's what's going on. If that was the case, then he would be a kind of closet conservative about utopia, and I don't get that sense from it. I think that the implication of the novel is more that even if a socialist utopia were achieved, and the book presents that in an almost propagandistic way as just unambiguously an improvement on where we are right now, nevertheless, the human situation as such would remain importantly unfulfilling. So it's almost as if the book is about what are the outer limits of utopia, even if we realize the best utopia that's currently imaginable. And I find that really, really interesting.
It strikes me that by having a kind of a vision of a clearly better world that is utopian in some senses, but that says, look, there is still going to be suffering, there's still going to be heartache, there's still going to be these other things that make life what it is, that make us human. I think that's quite strikingly utopian, actually. So I can totally see why why you would read it in that fashion, and
Yeah,
it definitely sounds interesting.
Yeah, I think actually I almost wish I'd said in the article part of what you've just said, because I think you've put it so well. Yeah, certainly there's a suspicion in the novel, I suppose, at least implicitly, of the very idea of achieving perfection, which I think the book is very skeptical about. I mean, I suppose I could imagine someone who's got a sort of hyper utopian outlook, posing some sort of problems for the novel, in the sense that, I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud, but I imagine someone like Ian Banks, for instance, might want to push back against the kind of pessimism of Neville's novel, and maybe say, well, part of what it takes for granted is, as you just said, is the human condition and a kind of human frame of reference. And maybe if we went down the route of some of the Ian Banks kind of culture stuff, of a sort of post-human world, then maybe even some of these like basic structural features of human life would disappear and things would be very different. But that's a kind of hyper utopian, almost kind of Promethean view, and yeah, I think that opens up a rather different perspective. But for the purpose of the article, I've stuck with roughly where we are right now and what's possible for us.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, I think when I read your piece, I was really struck by the idea, and as a preview, I suppose, to the intro, I have talked a little bit about what I've called the opposite, I suppose, of that, and actually sort of my sort of preference towards optimistic dystopianism to some extent. You know, this idea of reading dystopian texts, but through a kind of utopian lens, perhaps. But and something I think is kind of surprisingly easy to do, but only once you kind of get the hang of it. Because I think when I tried to do this with students, I often get a funny look. Why are you trying to tell me that this text like 1984 is actually something I should be reading in a hopeful manner? It doesn't seem like it should be. I mean, yeah, I kind of set it as my goal to try to do this, a kind of more optimistic kind of take on things. But dystopias, I mean, fundamentally are often about breaking or resisting embedded systems and structures, right? Which feels certainly like something we need right now. So the idea that someone can even stand up against a system feels, hopeful to me in some way. You mentioned Parable of the Sower, or you mentioned Octavia Butler's books, at least anyway, and Parable of the Talents in the piece. And you also mentioned Ursula K. Le Guin's The Dispossessed, I think. Might you say a little bit about those texts and why you think they are examples of kind of pessimistic utopias, rather? I think particularly Parable of the Sower, sorry, is 2024. It starts in 2024. It feels like the year of Parable of the Sower. I feel like we should be celebrating this novel this year in some way.
Yeah, I should say Dan Davison Becchioni and I are we're actually starting work on an article at the moment about what it's like to read that novel in the year 2024, precisely because it's set right now, and of course, so much of what Butler described in the early 90s, it reads much like a description of a great deal of what's happened ever since, to a quite uncanny extent. Yeah, my students over the last few years have consistently rated Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower their favorite dystopian text, all the ones that I've shown them, and also ones that they've kind of read and watched in their own time. And I think it is because there is a core of hope that runs through it. And what I find remarkable about that novel is that it is so extraordinarily bleak, and it's such a nightmarish future that she describes. Really, I think for me, more traumatizing, harrowing than most other dystopian novels that I've read in many ways. And yet, at the same time, it's also probably the most hopeful of them. Because the principle that Lauren Olamina, the protagonist, embodies is really a sense that even at the moment that they've reached in the United States in 2024 in those books, there is still a sense that actually things could be different, they could be otherwise, and who knows, they could be radically improved. So even in the face of all that, and there's something about the stubborn kind of pragmatic hopefulness of those books, which I think is very, very inspiring. And I think my students are tapping into that. So I think it's remarkable what she accomplished there. As for where the Dispossessed by Le Guin fits into this, I'm not sure. I haven't given it enough thought. I mean, her utopianism, I think, is quite unique. And I've actually just recently been writing a chapter for a book I'm working on, where in that chapter I look at the relationship between utopia and what some people have called post-secularism, which are sort of outlooks, views of the world which are coming after the secularization of modern society, but are drawing on religious sources. And I think there's something going on with Le Guin's fiction in that regard, because of course she's very influenced by Eastern traditions. And in The Dispossessed, you've got Taoism, to some extent, perhaps Buddhism and other traditions that feed into it. I think that gives her utopianism a very particular kind of flavor. A bit like Carl Neville's book, I'm just making this connection now, but a bit like Carl Neville's book, there's a kind of acceptance there of death and suffering, and what she calls at one point, I think she says, the limits of the self, something like this. Which the protagonist kind of spends a lot of time thinking about. So again, it's utopianism of a quite practical, worldly kind that's not aiming at perfection. And of course, famously, it's a book that's all about the problems that you encounter trying to run a utopian society. And it explores those wonderfully, I think.
Yeah, and I'm just recalling a moment in the text, I think, where the protagonist Shevek, he basically has to pause his research for I can't remember how long, but it's at least a year, maybe even 4 years or something, where he's got to kind of go into a kind of farm because there's a famine.
Yeah.
And it's just like,
Yeah.
we'll just casually throw that in there, but that's part of being a kind of utopian for her, is that, it's kind of inconvenient, but you would do it. And he sort of wavers, doesn't he? At certain points, you almost kind of sense that maybe he's not as convinced that this is a utopia, but I think, fundamentally he ends up kind of, siding with that vision of simplicity, but also connection, isn't it? I mean, I found it very powerful
It
novel.
is, and I think part of the dynamic there as well, part of the explanation for the hardship they undergo is because, of course, most other people still want to be capitalists and they carry on with their capitalist civilization. And the anarchists are really in a quite small minority and they're trying to get a whole world running along anarchist lines. And they've really got very little to work with. So I think that it's interesting that she's thinking about, I suppose, the relationship of utopia to what's outside it as well, and what's outside it is still basically capitalism.
Just one other kind of thought based on the piece that you wrote. I noted that, and I quote from you here. You write at
Oh,
one point that hopefully it's a good quote. I thought it was really interesting anyway. You say that the longing for utopia ought to be understood as a manifestation of hope rather than optimism. And I kind of, I think there's a tendency, isn't there, to use these terms optimism and hope quite interchangeably. And I wondered if you might explain that a little bit, what you kind of meant by that. Sort of what is the difference here between kind of hope and optimism, and how might we see it as kind of instructive in these examples?
yeah, this is it gets complicated, and it's not, to be honest, something I've given enough thought to yet. But in the article, I lean quite heavily on a book which I found very insightful by the critic Terry Eagleton, which is called Hope Without Optimism. And that's really about a kind of radical hope, which is invested in a better future, a better world, but which, unlike optimism on Eagleton's way of understanding it, does not just take for granted that there's going to be inevitable progress in the direction of something better. So, for instance, to take just one example, it would definitely be opposed to some of the techno optimism that comes out of, say, Silicon Valley. And you can see people talking as if techno determinism was true and as if the technology all by itself is just going to lead to a better world. So it's not optimism about our situation in that regard. It's hope, which is more like a kind of reasoned conviction that by working together we can improve things, but that it's never going to be something automatic or guaranteed or written into the laws of history or anything of this sort. And Eagleton is kind of much influenced by Walter Benjamin in this regard. And it's a more, I suppose, tragic outlook rather than the sort of sunny Silicon Valley notion that, we're heading to these kind of sunlit uplands because we've got more gadgets and, and so on and so forth.
I mean, it's interesting because I can kind of see it in two different ways. I mean, in some senses, like if I'm being hopeful, or hope implies something like that you're looking ahead at something in a positive sense, even though the evidence before you might suggest otherwise, because you're having to hope. You haven't got reason to. You kind of almost got to take it on faith that something good might come out of something. Whereas with optimism, maybe you just take, you take the details and you spin it in one particular way. I don't know. But then at the same time, if you said, well, you could accuse someone, if you say you use optimistic as often with a negative connotation, that someone is an optimist, or it means that they are fraudulently sort of, they're erroneously suggesting something positive. So maybe that, yeah, there's this kind of subtleties there which you don't tend to think about.
No, I agree, and as I say, there's a lot more that could be said on it. And Eagleton's book is a good starting point. One thing I do take from Eagleton, and I draw on this on the article a little bit, is Eagleton, and this is his definition of these terms, and as you say, people could dispute this, but Eagleton tends to think that optimism and pessimism are more like individual dispositions, like dispositions of a particular personality, and in that sense, they tend to be more apolitical. So I might just be an optimist, and every day I wake up expecting good things are going to happen. Whereas Eagleton thinks of hope as something more social and political in its orientation. It's like us together, we're going to do something, not just, I wake up every day and I happen to feel optimistic about stuff.
Indeed. And there's quite a bit going on, I suppose. I think recently we had Obama, or the Obamas sort of tweeting about sort of the Kamala Harris campaign, saying hope has returned, hope being his kind of political slogan, wasn't it, which sort of saw him sort of come to power in 2008. And the idea is that this is a similar sort of moment. So yeah, that's very much used in a kind of political sense that way. Yeah, interesting. I wondered if you had any thoughts about what the current kind of concerns are for utopian studies today. Where do you see the field, if you like? Is there a particularly pressing concern that you think needs to be addressed, or?
I mean, there's many, of course, and there's plenty of us. There's plenty of things to be worrying about. But I kind of increasingly come to the view that something we should prioritize in this area to really think about carefully is the issue of technology and how it's controlled. Because based on everything I've read in the last decade, it seems to me pretty much inevitable that there's going to be huge technological change in the coming, say, 100 years or so. I do recognize that there's a tendency in some quarters to, if you like, fetishize technology and to kind of isolate it from other concerns. And I think that's a big mistake. We need to avoid it. But technology is so bound up with lots of other things that we're currently concerned with. I think it can't be avoided. So we've seen AI that's being used to racially profile different groups of people. It's been producing some very questionable legal decisions. It's been used to survey dissidents and to control people in those ways. We've seen recently climate scientists, some of whom had previously been very critical of the idea of geoengineering, who are now saying that we're going to face catastrophic global warming if we don't use these geoengineering technologies. And, referring back to earlier, you've got people who are anticipating, between 40 and 80% of jobs being automated sometime in the next, say, 30, 40 years. That's without kind of touching on some of the really far out ideas right now about quantum computing and synthetic biology and all these other things. And I feel that any or all of these technologies, which are just mind-boggling when you start to really read about them, are either going to worsen our situation or they're going to improve it. And I think a lot of that will come down to what extent we manage to get them under control, regulate them, and bring them under kind of democratic direction. And I'm really scared about the prospect of these enormous, powerful new technologies being controlled effectively by a handful of billionaires. So I think anyone who's thinking about utopia and dystopia for the present century really needs to, read about and think about what's going on in technology and, how socially and politically we can respond to it.
Yeah, I think, I certainly share your concerns. At the same time, maybe I'm just ever the optimist, to use that term, and where there are these concerns, that also are opportunities there, and I don't necessarily mean the opportunity that these things will incrementally improve our lives, but I kind of mean on a kind of more radical sense, particularly in relation to, say, for example, AI, which obviously I'm concerned about, but the transformation in the workspace, I think, could be so dramatic that there will need to be kind of, I'm thinking about, universal basic income, these kinds of things. There will need to be something there that kind of mitigates that in some way, because the hands will be forced. It's not like the kind of revolution that we had where, we transformed from sort of blue collar to white collar professions. There's going to be nothing left. We can't all become kind of AI, creators in some way, right? So I do think that's, yeah, that's scary. It's certainly scary, but at the same time, we all know that we need to get to a place where we're working less. You know, we're an overproductive society. Most of the stuff we produce, right, is just stuff that ends up being thrown away or is kind of creating more landfill or creating more carbon in some senses. So we know we need to get to a place where we work less in some senses. And we also know that we can do because the technology is there. We're just not marrying that up with the kind of social, political kind of mechanisms to make that work. So I I'm slightly less pessimistic, I suppose, about that. But yeah, it's certainly scary. But as someone who's been kind of writing about play and work and that balance, I'm acutely aware that for most, most of the kind of sort of 19th century, for example, and into the early 20th century, the amount people worked was coming down. And people thought that, we would have a 20-hour working week and these kinds of things. You can see it in kind of those kind of utopias like Edward Bellamy's sort of looking backward and things like that. And it never really quite materialized. It sort of halts quite early in the, maybe the sort of 1930s or something. And we've stubbornly kind of stuck at this kind of 40-hour week nonsense, really. And I'm hopeful, slightly hopeful, I think, that maybe some of these technologies might prove the death knell for, if you like, for that kind of working attitude.
I certainly hope so. I mean, one thing I would say is if you think about the way in which the history of the Industrial Revolution is often taught in schools, certainly the way it seemed to be taught to me, um, it's often described in such a way that it's almost as if what happened there was that the industrial technologies came along and then everything else, just as it were, of its own accord, unfolded around those technologies. And what I think is really interesting about social histories of that period is how historians have shown that actually there was huge kind of social, political, and economic upheaval, and it took action by trade unionists, by politicians, activists, and many other forces to bring about the actual outcome that occurred during the late 18th, early 19th century. So
It doesn't just happen. We need to
exactly,
make it
it
happen. Yeah.
doesn't just happen. So I agree that there's huge potential in the technologies that you mentioned. I just think they need to be steered, and
Mhm.
that I think there's a dislocation there. There's some joined up thinking that's needed about it.
This sort of brings me to think about writing at the moment, and I just wondered what if you don't mind sharing with us, what you're currently working on.
Yeah. So I'm really in the process of finishing a book and also nearly finishing another one. I've got a solo authored book, which is really about the very different forms that utopia has taken over the last 100 years. And what I've tried to do in the book is not to look at familiar forms of utopianism of the kind that have been written about lots by scholars in the area. I'm trying to find strands of the history of utopia that have been at least neglected. I'm not saying no one has written on them, but they're neglected. So, for example, as I said, I've got a chapter looking at post-secularism and utopia and thinking about these kind of interesting neo-religious and post-secular outlooks and how that interacts with utopia. I've got a section where I look at this really interesting phenomenon of what's been called post-capitalism. Lots of people have written these books about, what does a post-capitalist future look like? And there I actually move from some of those kind of forecasts that people have made to looking at the film Blade Runner 2049, which I think is in some ways an interesting but very dystopian allegory for how some of those developments could turn out in practice. So I've got some kind of film analysis and things. And I've got other chapters. One is about utopianism in literary modernism, and I'm interested in how modernism and utopia link up. Again, I think it's something that has been written about, but I think it's been neglected for the most part by a lot of people. And I'm also, we've got two chapters left on the go, really, but I'm co-authoring a book with Dan Davison-Vecchione, and we're looking at the relationship between speculative fiction and social theory. Dan's a sociologist, I'm in literary studies, and we're thinking about how you can take, especially kind of classical social theory like Max Weber, these other kind of household names, and how you can put them into conversation with utopian and dystopian literature, and what some of the results are. And we've published a few pieces on this, and yeah, I'm excited about it. So two projects that are kind of nearing completion, sort of.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting. I'm guessing you talk about sort of rationalization and these kinds of issues. Yeah, I'm something I'm quite keen on. I write teach globalization in contemporary fiction as one of my modules, and we sort of think about Weber a little bit. Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Sean. This has been really enjoyable. I've learned a lot. I'm sure others have as well. As a kind of sign off, I've been asking guests to think of a kind of text, and we've already talked about several. I should think that you could name. It could be a novel, a movie, a piece of criticism, anything you want, really. Something about utopia that you think everyone should read or watch.
Well, and lots come to mind, of course, but one that's nice and short and freely available online, if anyone wants to read it, is the Xenofeminist Manifesto, which is, as the name suggests, a short feminist manifesto. It appeared, I think, in 2017 or 2018. You can just Google it. It's XENO Feminist Manifesto, Xenofeminism. And it's essentially a manifesto for gender abolitionism. And it provides some really thought-provoking and quite provocative kind of little suggestions for what a post-gender society would look like. I gave it to some of my students last year, and they absolutely loved it. So yeah, for anyone listening, do have a look at the Xeno Feminist Manifesto. It's yeah, it's provocative and interesting.
It was great to have Sean on the podcast, and I'm sure listeners will join us in thanking him for his time. I particularly valued his dismantling of the myth that utopias are necessarily perfect, his discussion of the difference between hope and optimism, and, of course, hearing more about his conception of utopian pessimism. If you liked what you heard today, don't forget to follow the podcast, rate it on Spotify, or send us an email with your thoughts. We've got plenty more interesting chats coming soon, so please do join us next time as we explore more utopian and dystopian fictions.